Hello and welcome to the Cut Class today. We had some technical difficulties while I was recording this video, so I'm doing a voiceover now. So we are going to make a triple cube tower pop-up card. It's a really fun card to make and surprisingly simple. So to get started, you will need 2 pieces of black cardstock, 2 pieces of decorative cardstock, craft knife, some hook and loop, Velcro dots or some magnets, whatever you have. You could even poke a hole and tie it or have a belt around it, it's up to you. Some super tack glue and some double-sided tape. You will also need some square nesting dies. I've used the stitched nesting dies from Paper Rose and used the 3 smallest squares in that set. You will need your paper trimmer and your scoreboard as well, and a piece of cardboard or folded up piece of cardstock to use with the craft knife to cut our boxes so they fold down into the card. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we will do is make our card bases. So grab one of the pieces of black cardstock and your paper trimmer, and we're going to cut the cardstock at 6 inches by 12 inches. Once you have those two cut, I'm going to put those aside, and we are going to cut our decorative paper to go on our card bases. So taking the zip strip off, we are going to cut 3 squares that are 5 7/8 by 5 7/8. So just cutting those 3 boxes now from your decorative cardstock. It's good to choose one that has a full pattern on it, or something that's non-directional, so you don't get worried about trying to match up the patterns. And it's great to use a double-sided paper so you can change around what part of the paper that you are using. This particular one, because it is black on one side and gold on the other, I've just gone and used the one side for this card. So once you have cut those boxes, we are going to cut the black cardstock. So the measurements for these are in your instructions, and I will run through them now. The first one we're going to cut at 4 inches by 5 7/8, and the second one is 4 3/4 by 6 3/8. And in your instructions, they're listed as number 1, number 2, number 3, so you can know when we get to the scoring which ones relate to which piece of cardstock. And then the third piece we'll need to cut it at 5 1/2 by 7 1/8. We'll pop those aside, and then we will cut our decorative paper. Cutting your zip strip off, we're going to cut decorative squares. So the first one, you will need 4 of these. The measurement is 2 1/4 by 2 1/8. 2 1/4 by 2 1/8, and you're cutting 4 of these squares. Just pop them aside once they're cut. Just don't lose them as you're going through, because we're going to cut everything first and then we'll get into the scoring. So the next piece we are going to cut is 2 5/8 by 2 1/2, and again you're going to need 4 of those. So 2 5/8 by 2 1/2 inches. Once you have cut those ones, the last one that we are going to cut, we're going to cut another 4. And this one is our smallest box. This is 1 7/8 by 1 7/8. Once you have these ones cut out, we are going to cut our acetate sheet. Popping those to the side. And onto the acetate. So it's always good before you cut your acetate and use it that you get your anti-static tool and run over either your pad, the tool, whichever you have, run it over the acetate, because that is going to stop anything from getting stuck on it, and it will reduce any fingerprint marks that might end up on the acetate sheet. So just quickly run it over with the tool. It doesn't need to be too powdery, but it just helps it getting anything clinging to it as you go through. So with the acetate, we are going to cut that at 2 1/4, and then 2 1/8. And we're going to cut 2 of those. So 2 1/4 by 2 1/8. I'm cutting 2 of those. The next measurement is 2 5/8 by 2 1/2. And again, you'll need 2 of those. 2 5/8 by 2 1/2. And then the last ones you'll need is 1 7/8 by 1 7/8. And again, just 2 of those. And once you have completed all of the cutting, you can pop your paper trimmer to the side and get out your scoreboard, and we will do our scoring next. So with your scoreboard, we are going to score our card bases, and they are scored at 6 inches. So they're 6 by 12. We're going to score at 6 inches on both pieces. Fold and burnish those. And pop those to the side. So we're going to need to get number 1 from the black cardstock. So this is the smallest one at 4 inches. So on the long side, we are going to score this at 5/8 of an inch, at 2 5/8, 3 1/4, and 5 1/4. Now in the video here I have folded and burnished these, but I'd recommend not doing that at this step and do it after you have die cut the squares from the black cardstock. It just makes it easier and stops the squares moving around, so it enables you to line them up beautifully. Okay, so number 2, we are going to score at 5/8 of an inch, at 2 7/8, 3 1/2, and 5 3/4. So again, don't fold and burnish in this step. Follow the instructions where it says to turn it around and score on the short side in half. So I do that quite a ways later on in the video as I'm trying to remember what is the best way to do this. So number 1, on the short side you're going to score at 2 inches. Number 2, you're going to score on the short side at 2 3/8 of an inch. And number 3, we're scoring now on the long side at 5/8 of an inch, 3 1/4 inches, 3 7/8 of an inch, and 6 1/2 inches. And then on the short side, scoring at 2 3/4 of an inch. But burnish and fold after you have done the die cutting. So once you have done the scoring, you pop the scoreboard to the side, and we will need to do some die cutting. We're going to put our card base together. So one side you're going to adhere on top of the other. So you have a full card and then a flap to close the card. So just adhering those either with glue or with double-sided tape, one on top of each other, lining the edge up with the score lines. And once you have done that, you can add the decorative cardstock into the middle, covering up the join onto the left hand side and on the front. Hand flap, we can cut that out using a pair of scissors, just freehand, or you can draw a line to cut around that, or you could even use a edge die if you have something like that in your stash. But you can do that at the very end, or you can do that now. You just creating that flap and working out where you want it to end up. So once you have chosen what you want to do, you can go ahead and use your border, die, or the scissors like I'm doing now. It's just freehand, so you can always change this and make it in a design that you would like, and whatever's going to work for you. So I cut it here and left it for a bit, but I think I want to cut a little bit more off. It's wide. So it's personal preference as to how far you want that flap to come across. You might only want a small one, or you might want it a little bit bigger. It's up to you. Okay, so once you have decided on that flap, you can always adapt that a bit later on. We're going to adhere our decorative cardstock. At this point, if you wanted to, like I'm doing, you can add your Velcro dot, your hook and loop spot, or your magnet, but again you can leave this until your card is completed as well and put it on at the very end. I do quite like these Velcro dots because they're quite unassuming, don't really notice that they're there, and they work very well. So I'm just stack them together to make sure it's lined up on the left hand side. Easy, super easy closure for your card. To finish that off on the side, you can add a sentiment, die cut it out or stamp, or emboss it on the front, and that is your card base complete. So we'll now need to put our boxes together so we can work on putting it up and folding down. So let's get into it. To do these boxes, you're going to need to die cut 2 squares out of each of the boxes. You need to make sure that you're die cutting the squares side by side on the short side, so making sure that you've lined up your short side. Try to make it the same orientation as I have on your screen, so it makes it a bit easier for you to make sure that you're getting those dies in the right places. So as you see on the screen, those bottom squares is what I'm going to die cut out, and this is where earlier I had said to do this at the start. It just makes it easier if you have that screw down the middle of each of the pieces of cardstock, because when you come to use your craft knife to cut the boxes open, it's just a lot easier to be able to follow the full line. Okay, so let's get into our die cutting. So die cut the 2 squares out of each of your boxes, and then using those squares you'll need to die cut frames from 2 of the boxes of each size. Okay, so 2 boxes, 2 of the squares of each size that you cut out, you need to die cut frames. So just cutting the middle out using those dies. So go ahead and die cut those, and we'll be back once it's done. So we are back with our die cut boxes, and just need to go and die cut the frames from the decorative cardstock. So you'll line up the boxes to go on the inside of the cubes that you're creating, and then you will adhere that on as well. So go ahead and die cut those frames from the decorative cardstock, and we'll be back. Alright, so with the frames all cut out, we can start putting everything together. So using glue or double-sided tape, it's up to you. I'm going to put acetate over the windows on the black on the top of those cubes, and then you're going to add the decorative paper opposite the acetate on the same side, and then the frames go on the front. Once you adhere the boxes together, making sure that the flap with the acetate, so the flap on the side that has the acetate windows, that needs to be on top when you're sticking things down. So get all of those put together, and then we'll come back to you. once you have all of your boxes put together, we are going to need to cut them so they will fold as we pop them in the card. So this is where you'll need your craft knife and your cardboard or chipboard craft mat, or just a folded piece of scrap cardstock would work as well. So what you'll need to do is pop the cardboard inside your squares, and then we're going to cut our boxes. So we are going to do the smallest and the biggest cut in the same way, and then the middle we are going to do it in the opposite way. So if we fold those down and flip it over, so the tab up the top there and down the bottom, we're going to cut through all of that. So you're going to follow the score line that we popped in earlier. So if you need a ruler to help guide you along that score line, go right ahead, or you can just go freehand and go slowly as you cut through that cardstock. So it's through that top tab we're going to cut through, right through the back, and then cut through the bottom tab as well. And then if there's any extra bits that are hanging off once you have cut it with a craft knife, you can just use scissors to clean that up. So once it's cut through, you can fold in half forwards, just like so. So trimming any excess off with your scissors, tidying that up. We can set it aside. And before you stick these in, you might like to add your photos inside them or some inspirational messages. It's up to you. So we're going to skip over that middle one and go to the large one. And the large one is cut exactly the same as the small one. So cutting that top tab along the score line, go nice and slow all the way through the back. So having that cardboard in there just stops you cutting where you don't want to cut. So follow along that score line all the way through the bottom tab, and then folding it forward just like we did with the small box. Now this middle one, we're going to do the opposite. So the first two we've cut the back, this one we're going to cut the front. So again, doing the tabs on the top and the bottom. This time we're going to cut down the front. So again, following that score line that we placed in there. It's going nice and slow. Moving that cardboard down, pushing up to the bottom tab and cutting through. This one we're going to fold back along that score line there. Okay, and now you have all of your boxes ready to go and ready to be stacked up on top of each other inside the card. Now this part is where it gets a bit tricky, making sure that you line it up and that you make sure it gets sits inside the card. So before you start gluing unlike what you'll see in a moment, I recommend holding it, like sticking it down on the one side, folding it down, and working on each level to make sure that it doesn't come out of the card. So you want to line up that edge with your score line. You want it more to the center, not where I've stuck it down here, down closer to the bottom. You want it closer to the center of the card. In doing that, the boxes will fold better and they will sit nicely on top of each other. So the best thing to do is to line up where you want it, making sure that those score lines all line up. One side down, so add a piece of a pencil line to mark out where you want to do, and then stick down the one side so you have time to let it adhere and to bond, and then flatten it down, add glue on the other bottom tab, and then fold the card over to adhere that second piece on. Whereas I've stuck them down both at the same time, and it does end up on a slightly not so great angle. So take your time in putting this together and lining everything up, because the next one that you put on there, you're going to want on an angle. You want the score lines to line up again, but you want it not sitting where I end up putting it. Okay, so once you've got your bottom one stuck down and it is folding beautifully and standing back up when you open the card, you can stick the next level on. So if this was more into the center of the card, I would have had more control over where things end up lining up. So you can see where I've put that. It's just a little bit not quite right, because as I fold it down, it's going to not allow the top one to fit inside the card. So on this one, you want to line that up on the opposite corners, so using that pencil line again, but you want to make sure that you have a good ½ inch hanging off the end rather than the small amounts. I had this one a bit too far forward and it mucked me up a bit. Once you have placed it where it's going to sit, so keep working on those angles and keep closing the cards. Stick one side first rather than trying to do two at a time, because it enables you to fix anything or any angles if necessary. Once you've stuck that down, doing the same thing with the very top one, you will need to be patient and let the glue dry. This is, well, I'm using Super Tack glue, so it doesn't take very long, but it takes long enough to dry. You need to give it that time to create that bond, and then it won't come apart on you. So you can see that I have that way too far forward, and I need to hanging back, 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 back. So we all make mistakes. I could leave it there with just having the two, because the two look quite nice. Just when I try to add the third that things go a bit awry, trying to figure things out. So the two, you can see there, it's not quite stuck on correctly because I haven't been patient enough. So patience really is a virtue in this sense. The longer you let the glue set and dry, the better your card will end up being. And then when you add the third card on, you want it to be sitting pretty much on top of the bottom one, which is something that I obviously didn't pay attention to right now. So you want it on the same angle as the bottom piece, and had I had that middle one back a little further and having that overhang at the back, it would have sat a lot better. So everything stuck together quite well, but what I found was that it wasn't going to close correctly inside the card. It overhung a little bit. So just have a play around with it. Think about where you're going to add everything. You could even use a paper clip to adhere them before you add any glue, so then you'll know if it's going to work for you. So just be patient, be kind to yourself, have fun. This is where it all goes wrong. I get there eventually in the end, as I just keep trying and keep attempting things, but that's why we said at the very start of assembling this is to make sure that you have just doing one side at a time with the glue. So it really helps you make sure that you have your lines right and that everything will fit in all together. So have fun assembling your triple cube tower, and we'll see you at the end. We hope you have enjoyed making this pop-up triple cube tower card. We look forward to seeing what you have made. See you next time.